This is ContraZoom, where we go back and forth about film. I'm your host, Dakota Arsenault. On today's show, we are continuing our A24 Retrospective series. This is our 31st edition of the series, and you can listen to recent episodes like 288, A24 Retrospective Mojave, 283, A24 Retrospective Mississippi Grind, or go all the way back to episode 108, A History of A24 Films, to get the full backstory on the company. Today we are doing something a little different. I was just a guest on the Classic Movies Live for a Director Showdown episode where they pitted Jason Reitman up against Joanna Hogg. For Hogg, we watched both the Souvenir Part 1 and Part 2, and I figured we would look at the 2019 and 2021 films since they are fresh in my memory, and I don't really want to have to rewatch them again in a few years down the road when I get there. So this is the first time I've actually paired multiple films up, but I may do something similar to this again when I get to Ty West's trilogy, but we'll see when that happens. But I want to welcome back to the show Jeff Ballmer and Pierre Frigon, the hosts of Classic Movies Live podcast. How are you doing today, guys?
I'm doing amazing. I can't wait to talk about these movies. I'm so interested to see how else we can talk about these movies under your guidance, Dakota.
We I don't know if our episode is out yet when this episode comes out, but it will be soon. And it was obviously in that movie we were talking about the Souvenir in, the context of talking about it in reference to a Jason Reitman movie. So it's going to be very different here. Here we're just talking about it on its own terms. And the Souvenir came out in what? It came out in 2019, right? The first one?
Yes, 2019.
Yeah, so you guys are currently on 2016 in your A24 retrospective, and it's been going for a few years, and it's incredible how you've got a lot of movies down, and stuff like this always makes me think, there's hope yet, because I've got one or two movies that I really, really want to talk about, and that I want to approach you for to be on the show, and they're in 2020 and 2022. You guys are still 6 years out from that, which in podcast time is 15 years. So
It really is. I know. Yeah. We are jumping very much ahead. And it very much is, this was something that was fresh on my mind, and it just sort of made sense to do it. And also, the idea of doing a crossover episode with you guys this isn't the first time we've done that. We actually did this before for the A24 retrospective episode number 181, Life After Beth. And we did that because it was a part of your Kicking It with Kendrick series that you guys were doing, where we talked about the voices. And so Rachel and I went on to your guys' show to talk about that, and then you guys came over to this show, and we talked about Life After Beth. So that was a fun crossover, and I feel like this is another one where we're sort of continuing a similar conversation between these two episodes. So obviously, if you've listened to this, I highly recommend you go over, and when your episode comes out of your Director Showdown, that people do listen to that as well, because it is a conversation with each other.
Mm-hmm. I think it's kind of funny that me and Pierre are both pretty frequent guests on this show now, and most of the time it's for series that you already have that are not intended specifically as crossovers, that we're still coming in for crossover purposes exclusively. That's not going to be
the way life works.
That's not how things are always going to happen. It just happens that's how it's worked out so far.
It's true, yes. I like it though. I think it's fun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm always down for crossovers. I think it's a fun way to steal your audience.
Yes, and vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
I have not got that much room.
You've got a foot on that side.
That's
and
not
I literally am on a ledge. And I've got nowhere left to go.
Do you think she suspects that you creeped down to our bed?
No.
I thought we'd put Anthony down the end. It's not that kind of relationship anyway, is it?
If she does, that was an amazing performance. Very special, Julie.
I don't think I am.
Oh no, you don't think you are.
Very normal, really.
You're not normal at all.
All right, well, let's talk about these movies today. The Souvenir films were written and directed by Joanna Hogg. Hogg, who graduated from film school in 1986, had cast Tilda Swinton in her thesis film, has steadily been working in British cinema for several decades now. The Souvenir Part 1 was Hogg's fourth film, with her previous three all starring Tom Hiddleston, who she gave her his first role to. In The Souvenir Part 1, we meet Julie, played by Honor Swinton Bryan, a young film student who falls in love with Anthony, played by Tom Burke, a worldly older man who has many secrets. We see the relationship as it becomes more emotionally abusive as we learn that Anthony is a heroin addict. Julie becomes more removed from school as this relationship becomes all-consuming for her. The Souvenir Part 2 picks up immediately after the first film ends, with Julie making her thesis film about her relationship, making these films meta on several layers, as they are autobiographical stories of Joanna Hogg's own life and relationships. Hogg even goes so far as casting Tilda Swinton, her college friend, to play Julie's mother, when in reality, Tilda Swinton is Honor Swinton Bryan's mother too. Byrne, I don't know if it's Byrne or Bryan, I don't know. I probably should have looked that up.
I mean,
yeah.
it's spelled Burn, but
Yes,
I
I should
know.
start saying it Byrne. Honor Swinton Byrne, yes. Before I get a note from Bill Antoniou that I'm pronouncing a name incorrectly. The Souvenir was announced to premiere at Sundance, and A24 purchased the rights immediately. The film premiered on January 27, 2019, and released in theaters on May 17th the same year. A month after securing the rights for Part 1, A24 announced that they had purchased the rights for Part 2 before the movie was even screened. Part 2 premiered at Cannes on July 8, 2021, before being released in theaters on October 29th the same year. This is going to be a spoiler-filled episode, so if you've not watched these films, we suggest doing so first. As mentioned earlier, this is a crossover episode, so if you feel like we didn't talk enough about the Souvenir films, or you want to hear about why Jeff is wrong about the movie Saturday Night, I suggest checking out the Classic Movies Live podcast in an episode that I believe is coming out not long after this one does. Is that going to be correct? It'll be probably a few days later?
I'm hoping it should be a few days later. It may be a week out. It's there.
Okay.
At the time of recording, we're waiting on a few things that need to happen first.
Okay. Well, make sure you check that out. I will share it when it does come out. But in that episode, all three of us agreed that the Souvenir films are artistically ambitious, but sort of lack enough plot to keep us actively engaged. But let's start with Part 1 and first discuss the relationship between Julie and Anthony. Jeff, as someone who is more moderator than participant, I'd love to start with you and your thoughts on the way this emotionally abusive partnership is depicted.
It's interesting. I think that like it's very low key, and you guys were probably expecting me to say it's boring, and I could say that, but like the thing is, it's not boring without purpose. Like there's a lot of the relationship in the Souvenir is very realistic, and it's also like never capturing the exciting moments of a relationship. It's just capturing the downtime, like a lot of the stupid conversations, and just sort of like, I mean, I say stupid conversations, but specifically like the ones that don't feel like they matter, and then somehow those are the ones you remember for the next however long. It's what I think is really interesting about the first movie of these two, The Souvenir, is that like it almost feels like when you're watching it, it almost feels like a story that's there's so little happening explicitly in this story that you kind of wonder why this should be a movie in the first place. And then, well, we'll talk about it when we get there. When the Souvenir Part 2 hits, it puts the whole thing into perspective in a way where I'm like, oh, the first one is actually really good.
Yeah, I think I feel very similarly in that regard, where the second one definitely made me appreciate the first one more. And I would say a good way to maybe phrase it is there's a lot of mundanity in the relationship aspects that we see, and it feels very grounded in the way the abuse is depicted, because normally when we see, abuse shown in film, it's, really over the top. It's often violence, physical violence. It's not the emotional aspect or the manipulative aspect of it. And this does a really good job that Anthony, by all accounts, was not a physically abusive person that we see at any point in this film. He never lays a hand on her. He doesn't hit her. He doesn't push her. They don't get in each other's faces like that. It's just the subtle, gaslighting and manipulation into him trying to hide his heroin addiction and how that impacts their relationship and makes it all consuming for both of them, even though she doesn't even use heroin and doesn't know that he's using for most of their relationship.
Yeah, it's a movie that, like, by the end of it, you just sort of think, like, why is this guy still around? He sucks. And, like,
Yeah.
you know, not even necessarily not even in that loud abusive way not even in that loud way that abuse normally is depicted, but just at the end you're like, why is she still around? But she is. So I don't know, I think that's really interesting. I don't see a lot of movies that depict a relationship this way, mostly because depicting a relationship this way is like it's not exciting. Like, it's kind of hard to watch, and I think that's part of what makes this movie work. But also, it's like, I don't know, it's hard to watch.
And Pierre, I'm interested in you. Like, Jeff sort of mentioned that we don't really see a lot of the good times in this relationship, but I feel like we do see a couple times where you understand how this could be an exciting relationship for Julie. Like, when they meet, it's talking about art, and he clearly shares a love of art and culture that she has. He takes her to Italy, and obviously that the Italy trip does end up getting soured pretty quickly, but still it's an exciting time. You know, I don't know if she's been to Italy or not, but he whisks her away to Italy. And then there's also, I'm trying to remember another, there's several like small instances where you can sort of see why she might want to stick around and that there is still interest. Like, they love going to fine dining together, and that sort of, you know, goes back to like this idea of like culture and arts and things like that, where I would consider fine dining to be in that same sort of sphere. Would you agree that there was enough to show that why she wanted to stay with him or what she was attracted to him about, or do you think we could have gotten more of that?
Uh, I I think we could have gotten more. I think it's more just about I didn't really feel uh, too much chemistry between the leads. I don't know if that's just the way the film was cut or the way it was shot in such a like a voyeuristic perspective. Because I think the way it's shot too, there is like a lot of room for the imagination to seep in terms of like I feel like the movie captures a lot of their very small moments, you know, kind of like those like kind of the lulls in any like not every relationship is like exciting all the time, right? And the way the movie's framed is it feels like it's mostly just capturing like sometimes it feels like it's just capturing like random little snippets of their relationship. And you know that there is a certain intimacy in being able to see them have these like quiet conversations together, and they're not like we don't really get any hugely like romantic scenes of passion, you know. And I don't think that's what the movie really needed. But to me, I think like just because of how passive the framing is, it would have helped to have a little more, little some sparks fly, uh, and for no, yeah, so that the style of the movie can really stay laid back. I need to see more chemistry between the leads for me.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if some of that has to come with how Julie is depicted. She seems like she is such an introverted person. What we sort of know about her is she's an only child. Her parents seem to be quite well off, not like super rich, but definitely rich enough that they can afford to casually lend her daughter, you know, several £1,000s sort of at any given moment in the 80s, which is, you know, I imagine a significant amount of money in today's dollars. And she's outgoing enough. Like, she clearly is able to, you know, make small talk and be friendly with people in her class, but doesn't seem to be that outward of a person. Like, the first, you know, couple scenes we get of her in her flat, she clearly doesn't like the people that she's living with and sort of has issues with them, but still sort of has some sort of a bond with them. Do you think that the lack of sparks maybe comes from Julie being a bit of an introvert and not being able to sort of show an outward connection? Or do you think that's just more of a grander scale of, you know, maybe it's, we were talking about on your episode, chemistry is sometimes a very difficult thing to organically show on screen.
Well, I think that I really appreciate Pierre and you like sort of clarifying that, because I didn't. I think that when I see this relationship, it's not that I don't believe this relationship. In fact, I think this relationship feels very real. And it's specifically because, like, maybe there are exciting points that we don't see because those aren't the parts you remember. Like, in any relationship, you're spending a lot of time with a person. Not all of that time is all the parts that they show in the romantic comedies. Like, a lot of that time is sitting around talking about things and having those interesting conversations. Like when you see her and Anthony talking, they're talking about things they both enjoy. He is challenging her. She is, having to think about interesting things. In this movie, you really do see Julie sort of uh, come into her own opinions about art, her relationship to art through this relationship. And I think that, especially when you're more introverted, the parts of the relationship that you remember, that you really remember, that really stick with you, probably aren't always the most exciting parts. There are a lot of this downtime where, you're probing each other's heads for this stuff. And I may have drifted away from your question there, but that's sort of what I think about this relationship at the center here. I do think it feels very real, and I think that interiority from her being very introverted and not maybe connecting with a lot of her other friends at university does sort of play into, does sort of make a lot of this make sense, I guess.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's an excellent way of putting it. And, we talked about this a bunch on your episode where I feel like we all really appreciate artistically what is being done with this movie. And for me, like, I think the performances are all very layered and deep and nuanced, and yet it still is not a very exciting movie. This feels like this is the type of movie that was explicitly made for one person and one person only, and that is for Joanna Hogg to work through her past. And if anyone connects with it, great, but I don't think that was any sort of an end goal for this. This really does feel like this is Joanna Hogg doing an introspective of her own life and how her falling in love with art coincided with her falling in love with someone, and how do you reconcile those two things?
Yeah, I mean I think like given greater context, it's actually like a very interesting creative exercise on behalf of Joanna Hogg. It does make me curious to see like her other movies as well in terms of like does the fact that this is so intimate for her change her style at all here? Um, but yeah, like it's. I mean, I also like um, what Jeff said too. Like, I like this idea that she's capturing a lot of small moments. You know, like movies are all about capturing big moments, right? And or else it's like, what's the point of putting it in the script? Because movies, especially now with attention spans, they have to be very tight and concise. You can't really have anything lingering. This movie is like all lingering, and and in some ways, like sometimes I find that pretentious for movie directors, but like uh, this movie just you can just tell already feels so personal, and it's really just not trying to do anything that anyone else is doing in the industry, which really like kind of gives it this authenticity in its patience for its subject matter. And
Mm-hmm.
it's this isn't like a um, like I think the very lo-fi cinematography and like score and or I don't even know if there is a score. There's a bit of a soundtrack, but um, really helps kind of nail down that this is not this. It almost feels like I'm not supposed to be watching this. Like this is someone's like video diaries, you know?
Yeah, yeah. I'm glad you brought up the cinematography because that's something I want to talk about too. I think part one might be one of the most beautifully shot movies I have ever seen. uses, I'm trying to figure out the best way to describe it, very muted color palettes, but then using like a single very bright white source of light. And so you get this very nice contrast of very bright white light that is not warm at all. It's very cool with these very cool color palettes that are, sort of desaturated. And it makes for a fascinating, look inside this camera, which I think she does a great job. But then a few times throughout, she'll switch what appears to be, I don't know if she filmed the whole movie on film or not, but she switches the way the movie is filmed. And the first time I noticed it was early on, was just after Julie meets Anthony, and Anthony says that he's going away for a few months. I can't remember where he's going, Italy or somewhere like that. But as she's saying goodbye to him, the camera, the film stock seems to change to Super 8 film. And it almost feels like in that moment, that is Julie basically hitting record on her brain, being like, I am going to remember this moment. This is an important moment in my life. And that she needs to make a movie of this or include this as some sort of a scene in a movie. And that was like, when that happened, that kind of like blew me away. I was like, whoa, what is she doing here? And she did this a couple more times throughout part one, where all of a sudden it would go from this like, very traditional, beautiful cinematography to this Super 8 format where you could tell right away because it gets grainy. It's a little bit more sepia tone-ish, the way the film is tinted. All this sort of stuff. Was this something that either of you had noticed when you were watching it?
Well, I mean, in addition to that, I don't know that I noticed exactly the points, the times that you're pointing out. But in addition to that, like, there is a lot of film in this. A lot of there are a few sections that I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, are just like they've got some narration from Julie, but they're just like scenes on, I believe, Super 8 film that were shot in the 80s. Like, this is just old film that's just kind of inserted in there from Joanna Hogg. In context, in the text of the film, it's like kind of implied to be some of the film that Julie is taking for research for her own film. But the metatext of it is that, this is literally just stuff that she's digging up from her past and putting in here where it fits. And yeah, I think that, like, what this movie kind of ends up being, where Pierre said it feels like we're not supposed to be watching this because it feels like it's someone else's memories. It kind of feels like this in a weird way, and I think that the Souvenir Part 2 makes this more explicit. But it almost feels like the filmmaker herself, like not Julie as a filmmaker, but the actual person who is making the film, Joanna Hogg, is a character in this film. Not in the sense that Julie is based on her, but in the sense that, like, the actual person who is who's creating the film, editing together the film, making the cinematography choices. She is like specifically trying to tell a parallel story in addition to what's going on here, which I think is like really interesting. And I think it comes out through those choices that are, not textual, but like very obvious and very clearly these very clearly metatextual choices.
Yeah, and I feel like that's almost something we didn't touch on as much in your episode, this sort of relationship to art, where I feel like both the Souvenirs and Saturday Night has their director sort of reckoning with what is their relationship to art and the sort of familial aspects it may have, because in the Souvenirs case, she cast Tilda Swinton and Tilda Swinton's daughter, who she's known for ages. And then with Saturday Night, you have Jason Reitman working with people who's portraying people that worked with his father, and how his father has a relationship with all of these people as well. And so it's very interesting, this idea of how do we connect to art and what does it mean to us on a grander scale. And I think that's what really the Souvenir is sort of getting to, just under the guise of a relationship movie.
We need to have you guest moderate one of our episodes, because that's what I was trying to get to the core of in that episode.
Pierre, do you have anything else to add about the way this film looks from a cinematography angle?
Well, yeah, I mean, like, I think the lo-fi also helps. Like it feels like it's shot on like, to me it feels like it was shot on one of those uh like old time, like I say old time, it's like from the early 2000s, like digital video cameras, uh in some ways. Like it's just very like it very home movie, like you could pop this in your VCR type stuff. And yeah, I think that that adds a lot to like the feeling of like I shouldn't be watching this, but also like it helps with the, I think it matches the editing style too very well, because it's like I'm watching like every scene we get, it's like we're capturing like five, like 30 seconds of like maybe a 1 hour scene. I know you said before that there was a lot of improv on this. I mean, I'd be very surprised if all of these scenes were like actually an hour long and they just took like 30 seconds of it. But that's like, it kind of gives you that feeling of like, there's a lot more to this than we're seeing. Um, and I think that's really cool too. Like it adds, again, with like this minimalist, it's even like minimalist editing where we really have to almost fill in the gaps of what's going on, especially because like the plot isn't always like um very obvious in what happens next. The way the scenes change can be very jarring, and you kind of have to almost reabsorb all the information that you see uh in the next scene just to catch yourself up almost like every time, which is like
Mm-hmm.
it's she shows a lot of trust in her audience, which again I think increases the intimacy of the movie. It's a very intimate movie.
Yeah, I think if I was sort of to paraphrase what you're saying is sometimes in the moment of a scene you don't understand what the context is or what it all means, but later on as the movie continues to play out, you're able to look back and reflect on those scenes and understand how it all connects. What's the connective tissue of it all?
Right, yeah.
Is that sort of what you were saying there?
Yeah, for sure. And I appreciate that aspect from her. Like it just it symbolizes trust, that like it's like she trusts that we're entering her memories, and she's trusting that we'll also be smart enough to understand what's going on, I guess.
Yeah. Is there anything other in part one we still want to talk about, or do we want to start moving to part two?
Um, I can't think of anything specific in part one. I think that part one is very much like the interesting thing about part one is the experience that she builds, which like I notice I if I have been paying attention the way that I think I have, we haven't really talked that much about the plot of part one because there isn't that much. It's like all about just sort of her experience here, which I think changes a little bit with with part two. But it's just a really, I don't know. I think I've said this. I said this before on one of our episodes. Like it's very much a vibes movie.
I guess the last thing I want to touch on is I sort of teased it a little bit in your episode, but my conspiracy theory about Anthony. I keep calling him by the actor's name, Tom Burke. Anthony, who we are told works for the Foreign Office, which doesn't really say anything other than the fact that he travels a lot. That means probably he seems to be somewhat wealthy, but due to his addiction, never has money on him. He must come from some sort of wealthy background. He seems far more bourgeois than Julie's family, and Julie's family already seems, solidly upper middle class. And so my conspiracy about Anthony is, does he actually work for the Foreign Office, or does he do something else that maybe Julie or even Joanna Hogg doesn't know? Because when we get to the second movie, she questions, did he work for the Foreign Office, to Richard Ayoade's character, And his response is basically, "That's what he told me."
And it kind of comes across
More or
as like,
less.
oh yeah, he works for. And she's like, well, he worked for the Foreign Office, and he's like, oh yeah, he worked for the Foreign Office, did he? Like, I don't remember exactly what he says, but it's like that tone. It's like, oh,
Yeah.
Richard Ayoade never believed it.
Yeah. So like conspiracy, like I don't think he was like some sort of, spy or something like that, but I wonder if he was doing some sort of work with the government that he could not disclose accurately what he was doing, really what he was doing. And so that sort of helps him compartmentalize and lie and avoid things. And maybe a part of coping with his work had turned him to drugs, including heroin, and that's what made him an addict. So, like, I don't have an answer of what my conspiracy theory about him is, but I believe that there's something that we're not being told as a viewer of what Anthony actually does for work and earn money.
I mean, if I had to come up with an answer for that conspiracy theory, I think he either works for the Foreign Office or he just doesn't work. I think that he has like lots of money that he can access, and he just gets by on that.
Yeah, that's fair too. Yeah, like that's another way to look at it is he doesn't even work, that he just, bums around.
Yeah,
Every once in a while, he'll sell a watch or something like that and come into a few £1,000s, or, get a gift from someone, and, that will sustain him for a bit.
I think like, I mean, part of it is like I don't really want to know because I think what's really cool is that, or not cool, it's very sad, is that she doesn't I guess part of the reason we don't know is that Joanna Hogg doesn't know, or I mean the main character Julie doesn't know. And I mean first with like you see him blatantly lie to her about someone else robbing her house, and then later it's quite obvious he did it. It really recontextualizes the entire relationship, the entire movie. It's like, okay, so because it's just like if he is lying about a heroin addiction, and then he's lying about someone breaking into her house and stealing all her stuff, like there's literally like that kind of puts into question like literally everything about him. And it also brings into question like was any part of their relationship meaningful or real. And as I mean, especially coming from someone who's depicted as being I would say a decent amount younger than him, there's this loss of innocence, I guess, that is really felt because of that loss of trust.
But I think that like what's a little bit interesting maybe about this relationship is you say that it sort of brings, if he's willing to lie about this and he lies about this, then, is he ever telling the truth about anything? And I think that what Joanna Hogg is really good at doing, and I guess she didn't write these conversations, they were improvised. But I think that with a lot of the conversations, the core of that relationship is in a lot of these philosophical discussions that you can't really lie during. Like when he's talking about what art means to him, yeah, he can be dishonest a little bit, but like you can't just you actually cannot be fully dishonest about your feelings about art in general. Like at a certain point, it's just going to come out. So like I think that when these specific actions, lying about someone else robbing her, lying about his heroin addiction, he could be lying about everything. But I think that what's interesting is that the core of the relationship, part of why I see Julie actually stays with him, is that the parts of like the main point of the relationship, the thing she gets out of it, is just something that you can't really lie about. I don't even know how you would.
Yeah, he's clearly, a mystery wrapped in enigma, wrapped in a riddle sort of person, where it's so hard to discern what is reality and what is fiction with him. And like once you start breaking down, well, like you were saying, is this real, is this fake, how can you feel this way and also be lying at the same time? Like there's definitely there's definitely layers to this guy that we clearly don't know everything about him, and I think that's interesting. One thing I was sort of very scared about is towards the end of part 1, Julie starts to get sick, and the implication we are given is that whatever it was came from Tom. And there was like a brief moment where I was like, sorry, Anthony, why do I keep calling him? Oh my God, Anthony, where there was a brief moment where I was concerned that he had given her AIDS because he was sharing needles with someone. Was that a thought that had crossed either of your minds?
No, not really, honestly.
Okay.
It hadn't,
Maybe
but
it was
maybe
just
it
me. I
should
don't
have.
know.
Now that
Yeah.
you brought it up,
Yeah.
immediately when you said she got sick, I'm like, oh yeah, that did happen, and I wonder, and then you filled in the rest of the sentence. So yeah, maybe it should have.
Yeah, like it was one of those things where like as soon as she's in bed sick and we know the implication is whatever it was came from him, I was like, shit, she got AIDS from him, didn't she? And then she ended up getting better. I was like, okay, so it wasn't AIDS, but she clearly got something from him that he got because, you know, he was probably being unsafe with his heroin addiction.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, that's really
Yeah,
dark.
I don't
I
know
don't know
it
what
was.
else to say to
Yeah.
that.
I was worried it was about to get that dark. Yeah. All right. Let's move over to the Souvenir part 2. If we do have anything that relates to the first one, we can bring it up. I didn't fully reveal the plot of part 2 in the intro, just because if you had not seen it, I hope by now you don't care about spoilers or you paused it and went and watched it. But basically, part 1 ends with Anthony dying, and part 2 is Julie deciding to make her graduate film about her relationship with Anthony, basically in memory of him. And we see her trying to grieve and get over that and understand what that relationship meant to her. We also see her potentially starting new relationships with different men, and sort of how can she be in a healthy relationship after being in one that was so unhealthy, all that sort of stuff. And I think an interesting thing to sort of talk about is we talk so much about Anthony. I love to hear what your thoughts are on the different men that sort of populate the Souvenir part 2. In particular, we've got 3 characters. We've got Charlie Heaton, who plays I think he's a dancer in the movie for Richard Ayoade's character. He's in one of his films, and then they end up briefly getting into a sexual relationship that doesn't continue onwards. And then there is also, oh man, sorry, I wish I had wrote this down better. The different male performers in this. We also have Harris Dickinson, who is playing the version of Anthony. And then we also have Joe Alwyn, who is an editor of her film, who sort of seems to have some sort of interest in her. It's never one that's consummated in any sort of way, but there's clearly some sort of chemistry between the two of them.
Well, and,
so yeah,
and
I'd
he's
love
gay, so like, there's no interest there.
Oh, right. Yes, she seems to be interested in him, and we're led to believe. I forgot about that. Thank you. We're led to believe that he is interested in her, and she sort of is mutually interested back. And then when she makes a move of being like, "Hey, do you want to come out to my place for a drink?" He's like, "I got to get back to my boyfriend. Sorry." And that sort of like is a real gut punch for Julie. But I'd love to know what you think of the sort of the 3 main male relationships she has in the Souvenir part 2. Jeff, we'll start with you.
I mean, Harris Dickinson in this he's the most interesting, I think, because he's like not really a romantic relationship for her, because I don't even think she sees him in that way. Maybe there is something I'm missing. I don't think they ever hook up, do they?
No,
Okay.
I don't think I'm not referring to it more in a relationship
No,
sense, but the fact
I
that
think
he's
that you putting him as one of those 3 main ones does make sense, but I think he's the most interesting because he's sort of a lens through which to get an alternative opinion on Anthony. Because in the Souvenir part 1, we see Anthony as Anthony, and in the Souvenir part 2, it's explicitly Julie working through her relationship with Anthony and everything that came out of it. And part of that is, I mean, she's doing it by making a movie. So when she casts someone as Anthony, and that person is an actor who, you know, does their job, that he's constantly asking her, like, I don't think my character would behave this way. Why would your character do this? You know, he asks about it in ways that make her actually question that relationship, which I think he's the most interesting for it, because, you know, you have to really, it makes you kind of reckon with, well, it's her specifically reckoning with the events of the first one, and then you kind of have to follow along, and you're like, oh, well, here's this alternate perspective. The other two, I mean, at least for me, and I hope this is different for you guys, but for me, they didn't really resonate as anything special. Like, they're definitely characters in this movie, but I didn't get a lot out of them personally, which I'm hoping is not the same for you guys, because I don't know, that feels like a character flaw on my part.
What about you, Pierre? How did you feel about the three male leads in this one?
I mean, yeah, I kind of feel the same way as Jeff. They feel more like part of the recovery process for Julie, I guess. You know, like she's been through so much, like in the last movie, that in this, it kind of just feels like she's looking for any kind of bond she can find with someone, but it's more reactionary than like, you know, I think out of like true passion. She's still very confused and trying to find out. And I mean, obviously, like she's still working her way through it with like therapy and like making this movie about it. Um, so yeah, like I do appreciate like the performances, and like they were solid, but like they felt more kind of like ways for Julie to kind of work through her grief, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
There are
Yeah.
two other male performances in this that I think do really stand out to me. One of them, and I hope I am pronouncing this right, is Jagan Aye as Marland, who is the one of her classmates who really, really helps her, like is a strong advocate for her film and getting her vision for her for her graduation film. And he is a fantastic force in this. First off, he's a great performance, but he also he really helps kind of keep her on track, because in the Souvenir Part 1, it is very much just her life as she's living it. In the Souvenir Part 2, she has like a goal. I think that the Souvenir Part 2 works as a more conventional narrative film, because there is actually like a specific goal that she's trying to work towards. She's trying to, you know, create this film based on her experiences, and Jagan Aye as Marland really helps her to sort of pursue that. And while there isn't ever really a romantic element between the two, he does feel like her closest confidant in a way that really none of the other male leads do. The other one that I wanted to point out is Richard Ayoade, who kind of ends up filling a similar role to Anthony in some respects as the first one, because he's the one who gets to be pretentious about art in this movie. And while it, you know, it doesn't always work, I do think that he gets like some good moments to sort of challenge Julie's ideas on, you know, why she tries to create art in the way that she does.
Yeah, I think the relationship she has with all these different characters are so fascinating and really do help to inform who Julie is as a person. And I'm glad you highlighted the Marlon character, because that's someone I should have thought about as well. He's in the first film, but he's there so often being like, hey, I can tell something is wrong. What is wrong? Just tell me. And Julie is so far removed from her studies that she isn't able to connect with basically anything or anyone at school because of this all-consuming relationship. So his character sort of really just falls to the background pretty quickly. But then we realize by having the part 2, it sort of highlights that he was there the whole time. He was there to support her and be a friend. And when she is able to, you know, when she's out of this relationship, because Anthony is now dead, she can't be in that relationship anymore. He is there, and she sort of realized that he was there the whole time, which I think was a really nice touch.
Well, and I think it's really interesting sort of how, well, there's a lot of ways that the second one really puts the first one into perspective. But I think that one thing that's really interesting is Marlon in the first one, he basically exists to occasionally ask her, hey, why aren't you coming to school? And in the third one,
Yes.
and in the second one, he like specifically, he's the one who kind of picks her up and tries to like push her through the rest of school. Meanwhile, you have Ariane Labed, who plays Garance, another one of her classmates, who has a like really kind of mean moment where I'm pretty sure that she knows Julie can hear her, where she's like, yeah, I think my problem with Julie is she's lazy. She just doesn't come to school. She doesn't like care about any of this stuff. While Julie is listening, and I'm pretty sure Garance can clearly see that she's listening, and she's just like, yeah, here's my problems with Julie from the first movie, when I thought she was a promising student and she never came to class and she really disappointed me. And I think that like having those two different perspectives from these people who were there the whole time and like, you know, have been kind of let down by Julie completely disappearing from their lives, to sort of see how they process. Honestly, the second one is just like a parade of opinions about the events of the first one, which is really interesting.
Mm-hmm. I think what is so fascinating about the second film is you have someone who is trying to not, I don't want to say forget, but move on and with their life and get over this past relationship by, you know, getting herself out there in the dating world, so to speak. Like she's willing to hook up with a guy. She shows interest in another guy. She's creating, you know, new friendships and things like that. But then at the same time, she's living in this past world where her all-consuming focus has to be about this relationship because that's what she's making her movie about. And so she can't just, you know, think passively about it. She has to actively be trying to remember all these details, the best, the worst, the highs, the lows, all that sort of stuff. And so it creates such an interesting dynamic where you could see that Julie wants to move forward with her life, but also wants to remain in the past at the same time.
Yeah, I think it makes it really tragic. First of all, because she's not, at least in my view, she's not. I'm not even really sure. Like, she's not sure how much of that relationship she actually enjoyed. You know, like when there's a lot of her contemplating in this movie. Like, well, first of all, there's a lot of contemplating from other people when they're making the movie as to like, why would someone stay in a relationship like this? And then also Julie's looking at it from a new perspective, like through therapy and stuff, where she's being like, why was I in this relationship in the first place? You know? And, I mean, I think it's really cool that, first of all, that it's like this, I feel like I've never seen a movie that takes the first movie and it's almost like an essay / analysis of that first movie, but also it's like done in a narratively interesting way. It's a really cool way of kind of not just like re-examining like the first movie, but I think you can take a lot from this and just re-examine your own past, and like it helps you like really question like your own actions and how to like maybe live with less regret, or maybe not regret. I think it's just more like helps you think about the past more and be like, what do I actually want from my life?
Damn, Pierre's getting deep on us. One thing that I thought was sort of interesting was Robert Pattinson was originally supposed to be in the Souvenir Part 2, but had to drop out due to scheduling conflicts with the Batman. And so his character was actually split into two characters and was replaced by both Harris Dickinson and Charlie Heaton. So it's interesting that the original idea was the actor that she hooks up with at the beginning of Part 2, she would then cast to play her ex-lover. So that also sort of adds an interesting wrinkle in, you know, Joanna Hogg's thought process on how to depict this film, and also sort of I don't want to call her, fictionalizing things, but calls into question a little bit how much of this story is she telling is accurate and how much of it is her making a story that reflects her memories that may not actually be wholly accurate.
Well, I think that like with the souvenir part 1, it is very much Joanna Hogg working through some things. With the souvenir part 2, it's Joanna Hogg using a character that she's created to have that character work through things, which is in a way also Joanna Hogg working through things, but
Yes.
is no longer as explicitly so. So I think that
Mhm.
like if the souvenir part 2, I would be fully willing to believe that the souvenir part 2 is 100% fictional. I don't think it is,
Mhm.
but like the souvenir part 1 feels very real. The souvenir part 2 feels much more artificial, but I don't think that's a knock against it because it's very much like, as Pierre was saying, it's almost like an essay on the first movie. But
Mhm.
like now, when you're making an essay on that first movie, you're no longer making an essay about your own memoir. You're now sort of thinking about the fictional elements of that as well and sort of figuring out, well, how would someone deal with this? And using your own
Yes.
perspective to like inform that, but it's no longer necessarily, if the first one ever was about 100% getting the actual truth fully accurate, which again it wasn't, but if it was, the second one no longer has to be about that because it's reflecting not just on her own memories but now also on her version of the memories and how she decided to tell that story, which is, as far as meta narratives go, this one's a really really interesting one.
Yeah, yeah. It almost feels like the Souvenir Part 1 was a film made by Joanna Hogg, and the Souvenir Part 2 was a film made by Julie.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I really have to say these two conversations we've had has almost made me appreciate these movies even more because I think the more we're talking and bringing different stuff up, the more layers I think we're uncovering, which is really fascinating. Where it almost feels rare to me that a movie can reveal itself so slowly and through so many layers just through sheer discussion, and that's something I really gotta hand it to Joanna Hogg for nailing and absolutely making a unique piece of art in that sense.
I do think it's a little bit, well, I don't know if it's a shame, but I would have really liked to see Robert Pattinson take over both that Charlie Heaton and that Harris Dickinson role because when you brought him up initially, I really think that Charlie Heaton's role in this is, to me, it didn't make the impact I wish it did because he's got a couple of very
Mm-hmm.
good scenes, but he's not in the movie that much. Where Harris Dickinson, to me, gets the more interesting he gets the more interesting role of having to like kind of directly process Julie's thoughts about Anthony and question her on them. And if those two were the same, then I think that additionally adds in that layer of, you've slept with the guy from this one production and therefore cast him in your new movie, which is something that a different one of her friends brings up at one point. I believe it's her friend. I want to say it's Susie, but I could be wrong. One of her friends later on is like, "Oh, do you have a part for me?" And she's like, "Oh no, we've cast the movie." And she's like, "Oh, so you didn't
Yeah.
think of your friend here, you thought of your other friend who's not even an actor. Interesting." And like I think that like bringing in sort of those elements of nepotism, uh they're already kind of there, but if you put Robert Pattinson in that dual role that's now these two people, it's even more there, which is like another interesting wrinkle to this whole thing that does kind of fall away when there's two people in those roles, but like I mean it's still, it doesn't delete the purpose of those roles. I just think it would be interesting to see Robert Pattinson take both of those.
This is the one time where someone not being cast is almost as interesting and adds more context to the movie itself than any other project I can think of. Like, there's been times that like you're like, oh, so and so was originally cast, or this person was considering. You'd be like, oh yeah, I bet you they would crush it in this. Or like, oh, I can't see that person there. Whereas here, it just seems to be adding more layers, which is fascinating.
Agreed.
I do want to sort of talk about, I mentioned how part one I thought was one of the most beautifully shot movies I've ever seen, and part two I thought was very well shot, but in a very different way. There's a lot more graininess to the film stock. It seems that she's playing around more with different film types in this, which sort of goes back to the idea of, she's making a film, so she's playing around and learning and experimenting. In this film also is playing around and experimenting with different things, whereas part one was like this, very gauzy, remembering the past sort of thing, whereas part two is more of an artistic project and how do you create art. And so for that it was very interesting because all the different film stocks, and I would say for the most part it's very grainy until we get to near the end when Julie is a professional working director and she's shooting a music video, and that is the clearest the footage the film looks at any point in the film. It is the highest quality look in the movie, and it's almost like this is her now graduating to professionalism, and we see how her quality and her work improves by this point too.
Yeah, and like I think the first one is very raw in a lot of ways and kind of feels like a collage. Like you wouldn't get there's no point in this movie where Joanna Hogg includes uh Super 8 footage that she shot in the 80s. Like it's
Mm-hmm.
very this is much more I mean a lot of the um the plot of this movie involves her having to put together a professional production. So I do think that this movie feels and I don't mean this in a good or a bad way necessarily, but like I do think this movie feels more professional in its production than the first one. Like it's more I would have trouble believing that this movie, that the Souvenir Part Two, was also largely improvised. Maybe it was. I
Mm-hmm.
would have a lot of trouble believing that because it feels in how it's put together so different from the first one. Even though it does, she is still fairly artistic. She's definitely artistically capable with both of these movies, but like this feels less put together. This feels like very deliberate.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent way of putting it. What about you, Pierre? Did you have any notes about how the look and feel of part two may have differed from the first one for you?
Yeah, I mean there's like there are some like touches that make it just yeah, like feel like it feels more narratively driven. It feels slightly more thought through. The scenes feel a little more important. There's a lot more artistic, I'd say, and endeavoring in the second movie. I think that's like I mean, I first of all, I think it works because the first one feels like such a like it kind of I think it wants to feel more chaotic, very messy. Uh, it was a very dark period of her life, and I think it
Mm-hmm.
feels that way. But then also like because I was from behind the scenes, it sounds like uh part it was initially supposed to be all one film, and then she couldn't get the funding the half of it, so she just decided to make the first part of the movie and then hope she could make the second. But I wonder if this was like she saw part one and she wasn't happy with some of the aspects of it, so she really like she took her time and with part two, and especially with the confidence that she was able to finish her story, maybe she felt a little more liberated and freed to be more creative. um, and I think that also works in context of the movie too, because uh, I'd say the Souvenir Part Two is all about finding, your own freedom, and I think it's framed and shot in a way that reflects that growth of character and of herself personally between the two movies.
Mm. Very interesting. Um, is there anything else that either of you want to bring up about the Souvenir part two?
I
I
just
really love the ending of it. I think that I guess like we'll talk probably specifically about the very final. Well, I don't know. The very final shot is literally just the shoot of the movie, The Souvenir Part Two, and then Joanna Hogg yells "cut," and that's where the end is. And I really like that because it does sort of. I think that it's every movie in some respect is probably an artist reflecting on their past, but like this is the most explicit version of that, and you get an artist reflecting on, like, the first movie is Joanna Hogg reflecting on her past, the second movie is Joanna Hogg reflecting on her past by way of a fictional version of Joanna Hogg reflecting on her past, and now, like, in that very final moment, you get, like, you sort of break away from the artifice of it a little bit, or like make explicit the artifice of it in a way that I really appreciate when movies do that, and I don't think it's an easy thing to pull off. I think I am lucky enough to have pretty much only seen movies actually pull it off when they try to, but like where like she sort of, I guess she kind of closes the chapter on her life, like explicitly through the means of what she's had her character doing this whole time. I think it's a really interesting way to end the movie, and I can't think of a better ending for it.
Yeah, that's fair. It's an ending that worked a lot for me too. It was something I said on your episode where, you know, it was like it was like a box in a box in a box sort of thing where we're pulling back all these, you know, layers, and we get this final shot of seeing the real Joanna Hogg. I don't think we actually see her specifically, but we hear her. But we see Joanna Hogg directing the movie that's being directed about her. That's about her character's fictional relation, not fictional, but her character's relationship. So it's so interesting how it all sort of comes together like that. And it's like just that perfect bow to tie these two movies together, where it's like, okay, this was a 2-part contained story. We now know everything we need to know that Joanna Hogg wanted to tell us.
Mm-hmm.
I will say one other thing I kind of wanted to add about Anthony, and kind of going back to, you know, the mysteries about him, is throughout the Souvenir Part 2, when they're talking about his death, very frequently, it sort of seems like it's being described like it was a suicide. And I just don't think it was a suicide. I think what had happened was Anthony had tried to sober up. And as we see in Part 1, when, you know, he's going through withdrawals, and there's that scene where he's got covered in his own vomit and blood because he's going through withdrawals, and he's got the shakes and all that sort of stuff. I think what had happened was he was going through withdrawal, trying to sober up, and then relapsed. And what happens so often with addicts who relapse is they think that they can continue at the strength of dosages that they were doing beforehand. And by the time your body's sort of cleaning itself out, you start to gain a tolerance back again. And I think what had happened was he had scored heroin thinking he could do the same amount that he always did. And that ended up being an OD for him, especially when you're going through withdrawals. It makes your heart weaker. And I think that's what happened to him, was he just did too much that he thought he could do. And that ended up killing him. And it was an accident. It was not a suicide in any ways, because we don't hear any sort of note that was written or left for anyone or anything like that. So yeah, I don't know. Do you think I'm being crazy with this, or do you think that maybe it really was a bit of an accident?
No, I mean, I think that what you're saying makes sense. To me, I never got the feeling when they were talking about his death and sort of making it sound like a suicide. I had never gotten from that they necessarily meant that it was him deliberately committing suicide. You know, it was a suicide in the way that many people might think of overdoses as suicide. Like, they go back, and because they don't want to be in the world that they have ended up in, and, you know, exactly that, they accidentally overdose. It's not an intentional suicide, but it just sort of, you know, it's them going back to something that they know at that point, or that they ought to know at that point, will kill them. So that's sort of the impression that I got. And I basically think that everything you just laid out makes sense to me.
it almost feels like someone of his stature, it's more respectable to say that he committed suicide rather than he overdosed.
Well, yeah, that too. For someone who works at the Foreign
What about
Office, after all.
right? What about you, Pierre? Do you have any thoughts on his death?
Yeah, I agree. I think like or with Jeff, I think like either way, like whether he actually committed suicide or it was an overdose. I feel like an overdose at that point just feels like in his mind, like after seeing what he was going through, it almost feels like he in a way like I'm giving up. I might as well just do drugs until I die. That's what it kind of felt like to me. I don't want to misinterpret Anthony's intentions, but um, after seeing uh, after he disappeared, that's just kind of what it felt like in my heart. I don't really know if there's anything narratively that really defines that, but yeah.
I think that's a great place for us to finish off. Are you guys good if we move on to our double bill pairings?
Happy to do this.
Sure.
I'm prepared, I think.
Amazing. Okay. Well, the game that we play here is we make a double bill pairing with the Souvenir, and because we're doing two movies, I personally am going to have a double bill pairing for each of these, but I am leaving it up to the two of you to decide if you want to do one movie or if you want to do two movies. So let's start with the Souvenir Part 1. Jeff, what would you pair with that?
Actually, my answer to whether or not I can do one movie or two movies is dependent on one thing. Typically, when you are asking for double bill pairings, you ask us to go outside of A24, correct?
That is correct.
Damn.
Yes.
Okay, so I won't. I'll give them to you separately, but I won't talk about them. Both of my double bill pairings for the Souvenir Part 1 were A24. I had two that I couldn't decide between. Both of them are A24, so I will ignore them entirely. Instead, I'm going to give. Would it be acceptable for me to give two for the Souvenir Part 2?
Sure.
Okay, so specifically for the Souvenir Part 2, this is one that only really applies for the Souvenir Part 2. There's a movie that came out called Cold War, which is all about. It's about two Polish artists in the wake of World War II. It follows them from the end of World War II, I want to say until about the 80s, and it sort of follows their journey as one of them is originally a dancer and then an actress, and the other one is originally like a playwright and then becomes a movie director. And it sort of follows them through 30 to 40 years of their artistic pursuits. And what I really like about that is it really is just all about, I mean, it's all about filmmaking, but it really emphasizes a lot of that artifice. Like you get a lot of those same kind of feelings from the Souvenir Part 2 of like, this is a person reflecting on what it means for him to be an artist and sort of what his journey is as an artist is. And what that means in the sense of in the case of Cold War, it's very political. It's very much about what art means in the context of the world we exist in, where I think it sort of complements the Souvenir Part 2, because that's sort of what art means personally, bringing in the context of the world that she exists in. It's very much what is Julie's personal journey, based, with the influence, with the outside influence of the entire world, where I think Cold War is really kind of an inverse of that. It's about what are the two artists' influences on the world around them. And it's very, very little explicitly. None of them are at any stage very important political actors, but the art that they create does still affect the world, and it sort of examines that. So I think it's kind of the inverse of the Souvenir Part 2. I specifically pair it with the Souvenir Part 2 because it is very narratively driven in a way that the Souvenir Part 1 isn't.
I love Cold War, so that is an excellent choice in my opinion. Do you want to say your second one now, or do you want to wait?
Yeah, I do want to say my second one, because my second one, I specifically said with Cold War that it's very Souvenir Part 2 focused. I would pick the movie The Wonder as a good as a good pairing for everything. I would say, if you wanted to do a triple bill, you could watch The Souvenir, then The Souvenir Part 2, then The Wonder. I think The Wonder is very different in what it's taking on than The Souvenir Part 2, but it's very similar in its approach, or than The Souvenir, but it's very similar in its approach. Because what The Wonder is, this is a movie. Florence Pugh plays I believe she is a nun. She might be a nurse. She plays an English nurse who goes to a small Irish village, and in that Irish village, there is a young girl who supposedly has not eaten in, I think when she gets there, it's like 6 months, but she's doing a hunger strike, and it's miraculously she has managed to survive this several months of not eating, and so it is up to Florence Pugh. Oh, okay, Florence Pugh is the nurse, and there is additionally a nun. And it is up to the two of them to monitor this girl and determine whether or not a miracle has occurred. And I think, and this movie, The Wonder, it actually starts off by like establishing that this is a fictional narrative and that it is specifically a movie filmed on sets. And at the very end, we get another similar zoom out where we see where we see the set and the artifice of it all. And what the movie really tries to sort of put into perspective is like it shows this very narratively driven story, and it shows this this impact, or this story that like if it is true, impacts the world around them, because it's very much, if this is actually a miracle, then all of the religious people around this small Irish village are have this miracle at the center of it, and it is very political. I think it like makes that sort of leads into that sort of makes them believe we as the Irish have miracles where the English do not in this case, which is very important at that point because of I don't think that's during the Troubles yet, but it's a very rough political situation. Um, but like it specifically builds up that artifice and shows the constructed nature of even this otherwise this story that you otherwise wouldn't think of it. Like it really shows how narratives shape the world around them, and it does so by examining a larger than life story that when it's told is actually very is very explainable and is much more mundane than it pretends to be. And I think that the way that both of those movies, Cold War and The Wonder, take this sort of approach to what does it mean to create art within the world and to reflect on that art, and what can that art tell us about the world. And it does it in a very different way than The Souvenir, but I think with both of them, you're getting to that same core and sort of having a director examine. In both of these cases, it's a more traditional narrative, but through the lens of what it is that they do. It's less. It's certain. They're both certainly less autobiographical than The Souvenir, but they're also like an artist looking at the world and saying, I as an artist, what do I bring to this, and what does this mean if I'm looking at it as an artist?
Another very solid choice. Pierre, what is your pick for part one?
Well, my choices are. I wanted to bring some levity after the. I guess this movie isn't that, but okay. I because of the minimalism of the Souvenir Part One, I really wanted to contrast it with La La Land, which would be a essentially a huge, like, it's very colorful. The musical aspect really amps things up. It's a very fantastical view on uh, two creatives, but I'd say Emma Stone is like kind of the main character from what it feels like to me, and she's also an artist pursuing her craft, but also she is at the same time distracted by a man, and I'd say their relationship kind of falls apart due to him also kind of finding getting lost in something that he isn't really passionate about either. In, in the Souvenir's case, it's heroin, and in La La Land's case, it's touring with a band that makes money. So I guess they're similar in some aspects, and I think La La Land would be a really fun way of kind of getting over the darkness and the minimalism of the Souvenir Part One.
All right, nice choice. And what about part two?
So for part two, uh, I I picked Forgetting Sarah Marshall just because I think it's my favorite. It's my favorite getting over a breakup movie, and I think both movies examine their past relationships in very over the course of the movie, but obviously in very different ways. And honestly, like after watching the Souvenir Part Two, I think that Forgetting Sarah Marshall would just be a very fun way of kind of also examining a relationship if you're thinking about it at the time. And they also kind of involve, Jason Segel also over the course of the movie, he kind of goes on to enjoy his own creative success in making his Muppet vampire play. So yeah, some similarities there too.
Nice. Yeah, I think that on the surface sounds like an odd choice, but I think you describing it works really well, and so I think those are two very excellent choices. So I will say for my pairing for part one, I'm actually going to go with Stanley Kubrick's film Barry Lyndon. I mentioned that I thought that Souvenir Part 1 is one of the most beautifully shot films I had ever seen, and I think it's on par with what Kubrick was doing with Barry Lyndon in terms of using bright natural light and muted color palettes that, not to say that there isn't a lot of color in The Souvenir, or Barry Lyndon, but neither of them are like a Technicolor film. It's not something like The Red Shoes or The Wizard of Oz or Singing in the Rain, which has such bright colors. And this is done very differently. So that's my double bill pairing. And then for part two, Jeff, you stole mine. It was going to be The Wonder for all the reasons you said.
Oh, wow. Sorry. Maybe I should have just said one.
That's all right. That's all right. That's all right. Yeah, so it works out very nicely because I absolutely agree. This idea of the artifice of art and what is real and what is not real, and how do you tell a story and all this sort of stuff, I think plays in terrifically between both The Wonder and The Souvenir Part 2, which The Souvenir Part 2 also relates to Part 1 because it is retelling that story.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there we go. Those are our double bill pairings. Gentlemen, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I really appreciate it. I always love it when the two of you come on, and I'm glad we can kind of have this crossover episode. But where can people find more of your work and what else you have going on in the CML world?
Well, let's see. You can find us on Spotify, where we have all of our episodes, and our most recent one, as of time of recording, this hasn't come out, but as of time of release, it definitely has. Our most recent episode is on the movie Conclave, which I think we had quite a bit of. I thought we had some really cool stuff to say about it. Specifically, and this won't spoil anything. I started the episode off with talking about the font of the movie, of just the credits for like 10
Love
minutes. So, there's a lot to say about just the font choices in that movie, and I think they actually say something quite interesting. I got Pierre to say he needed to rewatch the movie just for the opening credits. So,
That's a win.
So anyway, that's our most recent movie that we've covered. Also, very soon, if it is not out already, which at the time of this release it probably isn't, but very soon you'll be able to hear our 6th episode of Director Showdown, where we talk about Jason Reitman and Joanna Hogg. We are getting ready for that 7th episode, which right now we're not like locked into a schedule, but they kind of tend to be about every month and a half. And so It's a 64-person tournament bracket where we will eventually arrive at a winner. Realistically, by about the end of 2026, maybe, if we're lucky. So, tune in now. You'll be on the ground floor.
Love it. Yeah, I'm a big fan of this series. I always enjoy every episode that you do, so I'm excited that you guys are going full steam ahead for that. And I'm very excited to listen to your Conclave episode. That is currently my #1 movie of the year.
All right. Well, I hope you enjoy our episode. It's a very, very good one. And I mean the movie, too. Conclave is a very good movie. If you have not yet seen Conclave, and we have piqued your interest with the idea that you might want to come and listen to our episode on it, we're really bad with our spoiler warning in that one. Like, we spoil everything, and then I'm like, oh, hey, spoilers, by the way. So you should go and watch the movie. And you really should, because it's a riot to see in a theater. I saw it in like a packed theater, and it was amazing. So you should go and see that movie in a packed theater, and then you should come and listen to our episode.
Yeah, I saw it with during VIF with a packed crowd there. Very vocal crowd. It was fantastic. And then as I was leaving, I noticed in the lobby, the actor who played Cardinal Benitez was in the audience, because he's apparently Vancouver-based.
Oh, wow.
Ooh.
Yeah. So I was very excited that I saw him. I didn't get a chance to talk to him or get a picture or anything like that, but I thought that was very exciting nonetheless.
Cool.
Yeah. So yeah, once again, guys, thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming on today.
Yeah, thank you for having us. We'll be on again eventually, I'm sure.
You definitely will. This has been a That Shelf podcast. Visit thatshelf.com for more great film discourse. Follow the show on Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky at ContraZoomPod. What are your thoughts on the Souvenir Part 1 and Part 2? Leave a comment on Spotify or send us an email. Thank you to Eric and Kevin Smale for the theme music and to Stephanie Pryor for the logo design. If you like to listen to podcasts on YouTube, we do post all episodes there as well. And if you really like the show, consider tipping us on coffee. Thanks for checking us out.